The 2023 federal budget is laying out more than $40 billion in new spending over the next 6 years. That includes new money for health care, also some inflation relief for families and initiatives for clean energy. There's a lot there. To help us break it down is TD Deputy Chief Economist Derek Burleton. Derek, thanks for joining us. Let's start with this idea that this budget was not going to be one of great fiscal spending. What are you seeing in it?
It's one of great fiscal spending. You mentioned about 50 billion in new spend. That was pretty close to some of the whisper numbers ahead of the budget. But I think part of the confusing story was the minister herself was saying she was going to inject some restraint in this. And there was about 7 billion in efficiencies they're going to target, lower consulting fees paid by the government. But the new spend's pretty big. I think if you look at spending per capita now, it's well over 10% higher than pre-pandemic. This follows a budget last year with 50 billion in new measures. So, it is a big budget. Now, when you look at the measures, a lot of these do make sense. And we're known ahead of the budget, the healthcare, transfers to provinces. These were all items that, were either announced and were demanded by Canadians. The green tech money, of course, response to the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. couldn't get away from that. We had to meet that. So when you go through a lot of these measures, they were needed, but the bottom line is spending is a challenge, and the fiscal position is going to be a challenge for years to come.
You mentioned the fact that, of course, the Americans are going big when it comes to clean energy. U.S. President Joe Biden was just here in recent days saying Canada has the minerals that the world needs for clean energy. We just have to get at them. So you talked about the clean energy initiatives. All in all, it's about $20 billion over the sort of projection of this budget. $4.5 billion of that is just for manufacturing, to try to incentivize some mining. Is that going to be enough for us to compete on the global stage?
It's hard to say. So the government has used a combination of carrots and sticks. This budget leans more on the carrots, and that was exactly what was in the Inflation Reduction Act introduced south of the border. It's a big amount of money. I think when you start layering the spend over the past few, last year's budget, the fiscal update, you are above that kind of 50 billion that you needed to respond on a per capita basis. I think for Canada, the big challenge comes more not with the incentives, but with the process. I think in particular, you talk about critical minerals being a huge opportunity for Canada to get in under the U.S. tent, to engage in supply chains. We've got, natural potential here in Canada, but regulatory burden is a huge challenge. And I'm not sure how much was in the budget and on shortening some of the timelines to getting project approval. So I think for Canada, again, the money I do consider this an investment part of the budget. It's, as you mentioned, Greg, a good share of the new initiatives. Now, how do we get the money flowing and respond in that fashion? I think that's going to be our big challenge as a country.
In the near term, the budget is willing to admit, and they say that they rely on Bay Street economists to give them their economic projections, and they say there's a risk of a shallow recession this year. So as I take a look at some of the numbers they're laying out, there's a $40 billion deficit. They think real GDP for the year will come to about 0.3%, just above break even, with maybe a shallow recession baked into all that. I guess what I'm trying to say is, are the numbers in here contingent on us escaping a harder landing for the economy?
Yeah, and that's my big worry. So, when I look at the budget assumptions, I know they did do away with their reserve allowance. That used to be baked into the budget to help in the event of unforeseen downside risks. They don't really have that anymore. But when I look at their 2023 numbers, they're actually quite cautious. Beyond that, they look reasonable. So the starting point does provide a bit of cushion. But in the event of a recession, and that's my worry. The bigger deficits, you can argue there weren't a lot of tax increases in the budget above and beyond what we knew, which is a good thing. But that could just be delayed tax increases, because the bigger deficits, again, tied to the spend, tied in part to the economic slowdown built in, just leaves less wiggle room in the event we run into a hard landing. And that's the worry. I think when I look at the deficits, I can live with them. In fact, they don't have a balanced budget. But now with the debt higher, interest costs hitting the books, if we do have a serious recession, then Canada won't be in nearly as good a position as it once was. And that's been something we've we've certainly pounded our drum about being a triple credit rated country. But of course, if we go into a serious recession, that's going to be a serious challenge to that.
Derek, most of our conversations of late have been dominated by inflation. We've gotten this far without mentioning it, but there are targeted measures in here for families who are struggling with the high cost of living. This, what they're calling the grocery rebate alone, which is really through the GST mechanism, $2.5 billion. Are they striking the right tone here? Because there's concerns that if you try to help households with the inflationary burden, your help could be inflationary.
Yeah, it's one-time measure. It's probably not going to be that inflationary. I guess my worry is that with all the provincial budget measures, start adding everything up, it gets to be a big near-term spend. But based on my expectations, I did anticipate something. There's just so much pressure on the government. It would have been a very tough choice. The fact it's one time, I can live with it. It's not ideal. As a share of the budget, it's not a huge amount of the spend, as you point out. So. The balance, yes, in a perfect world, they wouldn't have done it, though.
When I was taking a look through the budget, Derek, and seeing all their projections for where they think we're going to be in the economy this year, they talked about CPI, the Consumer Price Index, inflation headline at least, coming down to about 3.5% at some point this year. Not back down to the sweet spot, but getting closer. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you think we're obviously working down headline? Can we get it down that far this year?
I think so. I'm comforted by some of the latest data on inflation. I think, again, one of the uncertainties is all the fiscal impulse coming through provincial and federal government during this budget season. Thank goodness some of the latest data inflation do show some dissipation inflation pressures. With the slowdown we've got built in, with all the headwinds we're facing and some of the latest financial instability, I do think there's a good chance that we get down, to about 3.5, which is very much in line with the budget. So no qualms there.
Derek, appreciate your time as always and helping us break all this down today.
Thank you.
That was TD Deputy Chief Economist Derek Burleton helping us break down Budget 2023.